Over 2,500 years ago, a Hebrew prophet warned his people about a rising empire from the east, an empire whose power would shape wars for centuries. But what exactly did Ezekiel see? And why are his words still echoing today when we talk about Iran's influence in the Middle East? Stay with me, because this ancient prophecy might be more relevant now than ever. Most people scroll past headlines about Iran's threats, half listening as another conflict flickers on their screens before dinner. But what if I told you that this tension, this modern fear, was carved into the pages of an ancient scroll thousands of years ago? Ezekiel, a prophet forgotten by many, warned about Persia long before Persia changed its name to Iran, and long before Israel even existed as a modern state again. He saw it coming, a restless enemy, alliances forming in the shadows, a storm gathering in the north. You might think this is just religious symbolism or outdated myth. It's not. The pages are alive because the story is alive. Iran's rise is not a fluke of politics or a passing drama of Middle Eastern power struggles. It's a thread in a larger pattern, a pattern Ezekiel sketched when the idea of nuclear weapons and oil politics was beyond human imagination. But there's a piece almost no one mentions when quoting Ezekiel, a detail buried in the lines that shifts everything we think we know about Israel's greatest threat. I'll get to that soon. But first, you need to see how deep this warning really runs. Stay with me, because once you understand why Ezekiel spoke Persia's name with such certainty, you'll never look at a headline about Iran the same way again. And more importantly, you'll see why this ancient warning is less about fear, and more about who truly holds power when the storm finally breaks. Centuries before the modern maps drew Iran's borders, before diplomats argued over nuclear deals and sanction lists, Ezekiel saw a coalition rising from the far reaches of the north and the east. He wrote of Gog and Magog, of Persia standing alongside strange ancient names that scholars now match to Russia, Turkey, Libya, and Sudan. These were not allies in Ezekiel's time. They were scattered powers with nothing binding them together except distance and distrust. Yet he declared that a day would come when their swords would point in the same direction: Israel. Israel itself was an impossibility when Ezekiel spoke. A kingdom in ruin, a people scattered like dust. Yet he painted two scenes. First, a valley of dry bones knitting back into a living nation. And then, immediately after, a storm of armies roaring down to crush that nation once it was reborn. This sequence matters more than people realize. Israel had to rise first for the invasion to even exist. And against all logic, it did. In 1948, after nearly 2,000 years in exile, the bones rattled and stood upright under a single flag. The headlines called it a geopolitical miracle. Ezekiel called it a prelude. But there's a detail buried here that modern headlines blur out. When Ezekiel named Persia as a key player, he wasn't just listing random enemies. He marked Persia because its role would be relentless, fueled by an ancient hatred, sharpened by alliances no one thought possible. Most people think of Iran today as just another Middle Eastern rival. But to Ezekiel, Persia was the fuse. And that fuse is burning right now. But hold that thought. There's more behind this warning, and we're not ready to lift that veil just yet. Decades of news coverage have reduced Iran to a cycle of sanctions, nuclear negotiations, and televised threats. It's easy to switch the channel, to dismiss it as endless Middle Eastern unrest. But beneath every missile test and every speech calling for Israel's destruction, there's an echo of Ezekiel's ancient warning, a pulse that hasn't stopped beating since the prophet first uttered Persia's name. Iran today isn't simply a hostile neighbor to Israel. It is the banker behind Hezbollah's rockets in Lebanon, the silent partner funding Hamas's tunnels in Gaza, the unseen hand stirring militias in Syria and Iraq. These are not isolated sparks of conflict. They are coordinated sparks feeding the same fire. A fire Ezekiel foresaw licking at Israel's borders when the dry bones stood alive again. The world calls it terrorism. Ezekiel called it alignment. What most forget is that Iran doesn't act alone. Its ambitions stretch far beyond its own borders because it has learned to anchor itself to bigger giants: Russia and, increasingly, Turkey. This triangle, Iran, Russia, Turkey, once sounded like a fantasy to historians. Three nations with conflicting cultures, rival pasts, and agendas that rarely aligned. But here they stand, trading weapons, sharing intelligence, practicing joint war games in Syrian deserts just miles from Israel's northern fence. These headlines are not random collisions of politics and military posturing. They are pieces falling exactly where Ezekiel laid them. But this isn't the whole picture yet. There's a strategic reason these nations tolerate each other's ambitions, and why Persia, above all, remains the stubborn heartbeat of this coalition. We'll pull that thread in a moment. For now, remember this: what you see on the news as instability is, in prophetic language, a countdown. And it's moving faster than most dare to admit. To understand why Iran's threats carry more weight today than ever before, you have to see who's quietly standing behind them. Decades ago, Russia had little stake in Middle Eastern sand and blood. It watched from a distance, focused on its Cold War with the West. Turkey, a NATO ally, guarded its doors against Soviet influence and proudly called itself a bridge to Europe. Iran, isolated by sanctions, survived alone on defiance and oil revenue. Three separate stories, no clear connection, yet Ezekiel sketched them together on the same battlefield. He spoke of Gog, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah, ancient tribes that scholars link to modern Russia and Turkey. Persia, Iran, was already there, an unwavering anchor. No treaty or summit could explain this unnatural closeness. But step into Syria today, and you'll see Russian jets flying cover for Iranian militias. You'll see Turkish influence creeping deeper into northern territories once controlled by Western-backed forces. You'll hear whispers of weapon deals, oil swaps, and political nods that make no sense in isolation but fit perfectly when seen through the lens of a prophet standing in the ruins of Jerusalem. This alliance is not built on trust or shared values. It's cemented by mutual hostility toward Israel and the West, and a hunger for regional power that outweighs old grudges. Russia needs warm ports and leverage over Europe's energy. Turkey wants to revive its sense of lost empire, balancing East and West on its own terms. Iran wants survival and dominance cloaked in religious zeal. Separate ambitions, but a single target draws them close enough to tolerate each other's ambitions: Israel. Most diplomats call this a pragmatic axis, a necessary evil of modern geopolitics. But Ezekiel saw it first, a confederation no historian would dare predict, pointing their swords at the same stretch of land smaller than the state of New Jersey. And still, one question lingers behind this gathering storm. Why does Persia always stand at the center? That answer reveals the deeper warning in Ezekiel's words. And it's closer than you think. Nothing in the last 2,000 years made less sense than the idea that a scattered, nearly erased people would rise again, speak their ancient language, plant vineyards on dry hills, and defend skyscrapers with cutting-edge technology. Yet that's exactly what happened when Israel's flag went up in 1948. Mark Twain once called Palestine a desolate country. Ezekiel called it the soil for dry bones. Bones, he said, would rattle back to life long before any invasion could threaten them. This sequence is not a poetic accident. It's the hinge of the entire prophecy. Ezekiel 37 breathes life into the bones, sinews forming, skin covering them, breath returning. Only after that vision comes chapter 38, the storm. A reborn Israel surrounded again, but this time not by outdated kingdoms, but by modern armies carrying drones, guided missiles, and the power of alliances that span continents. For decades, skeptics laughed at the idea. Israel was too small, too vulnerable, too new. It wouldn't survive its first wars. But it did. 1948, 1967, 1973. Conflicts where outnumbered farmers and immigrants turned back entire coalitions. These victories were stunning. But Ezekiel's invasion paints a different endgame. Not one where Israel's jets win the skies, but where no human strategy matters. Because in this final clash, God himself interrupts the battlefield. But before we get there, remember this. The miracle of Israel's rebirth isn't just a footnote for historians or Sunday school charts. It's the fuse that makes Persia's warning possible. Without Israel alive, the alliance Ezekiel described has no purpose. Now that it stands, flourishing against every odd, the pieces are in place for the conflict he sketched. And yet, the real shock is not that enemies gather again. It's what stops them when no Iron Dome can. We'll come back to that, because the trigger is only half the story. The conclusion changes everything about how we see power itself. Every generation has watched Israel win battles by sheer will and fierce intelligence. Newspapers love to analyze its technology, its secret services, its iron domes that intercept threats before they touch the soil. But Ezekiel's final vision defies every modern explanation. In this conflict, the prophet doesn't describe tanks or jets turning the tide. He describes the earth itself convulsing under armies that think they are unstoppable. He writes of a quake so fierce that mountains collapse, walls split apart, and even the sea trembles. Invading forces, united by hatred, are thrown into confusion, blades turning on each other in blind panic. Fire rains from the sky. Hailstones crash through formations that satellites once tracked confidently. It reads like fantasy until you remember. Israel's survival has never obeyed conventional math. This is the piece modern strategists ignore. They plan for deterrence, counterstrikes, alliances with superpowers. But Ezekiel shows a day when none of that matters because the battle shifts beyond human hands. God steps in, not through a diplomat or an advanced defense system, but through raw, unmistakable force. A force that sends a single message to every nation watching. Israel's ultimate safety does not rest on its weapons, but on the one who promised it would never vanish again. People debate whether this passage is literal or symbolic. But look at history. Every survival Israel has claimed felt improbable. Its mere existence insults probability. So when Ezekiel speaks of storms and fire, and the invaders destroying themselves, perhaps it's not poetic exaggeration. It's a final statement about who controls history when every headline fails. But there's a reason this isn't the most terrifying part of the prophecy, nor the most comforting. That's where we turn next. Because what happens after the clash reveals more about us than it does about them. It's tempting to treat Ezekiel's vision like an ancient riddle reserved for theologians and history buffs. But if the bones rose, if Persia stands hostile exactly where he said it would, And if alliances that once seemed laughable are now headline realities, then we have to ask what this means for people far from Israel's borders, scrolling through updates on their phones, wondering if any of this actually touches them. Ezekiel's clash is not only a military forecast, it's a wake-up call to trust power that doesn't come from governments or treaties. If God defends Israel when missiles fly and tanks roll through valleys once filled with shepherds, then He keeps every promise He ever spoke, including the ones about you. That's the quiet thread woven into this prophecy. It's not about paralyzing fear of world war or guessing dates for apocalypse debates. It's about certainty that no rising empire, no reckless regime, no coalition of iron and oil can undo a word God spoke. This matters when your own life shakes, when the news is bad, the bank balance is thin, or your plans collapse under weight you didn't expect. Ezekiel didn't write these words to terrify. He wrote them so that generations later, believers would lift their heads when the world bows under panic. But if we only nod at the prophecy and keep living unchanged, we miss its sharpest edge. It demands an answer. If you believe He holds nations in place, do you trust Him to hold you steady too? Hold that question, because what He does in Israel is meant to echo through how you face tomorrow. There's one final piece to this ancient puzzle, and it's the part no headline will ever shout for you. That's how we end this. So here we stand, watching headlines flicker about nuclear talks and drone strikes, while an ancient voice whispers through the static, "I told you Persia would come. I told you they wouldn't stand alone. And I told you I'd step in when the storm broke." This isn't a fable to calm children before bed. It's a blueprint reminding grown men and women that behind every fragile peace deal and every hidden bunker is a certainty no military strategist can undo. Ezekiel's warning about Iran isn't really about Iran's power. It's about a boundary no regime can cross without encountering the fury of a God who defends His promise. And for us, it means fear is a waste of breath when the one who orders earthquakes and thunder also holds your future quiet in His hand. Some will brush this off. They'll scroll on, muttering that ancient prophets have nothing to do with tomorrow's stock market or next month's rent. But they'll miss the simplest truth buried under all the alliances and battle maps. Prophecy isn't a threat. It's a mercy. It tells you how the story ends, so you can live awake now. So watch Iran. Watch Russia. Watch every headline that tries to spin chaos as random. But don't stop there. Look deeper. Ezekiel didn't warn us so we would tremble. He warned us so we would stand steady when the ground shakes, certain that the same God who guards His land also guards His people. If you've stayed with me this far, you're not like most who just want the thrill of fear. You're hungry for perspective that doesn't crack when the world does. So here's my quiet challenge. Lift your head. Check your own foundations. And before this day ends, ask yourself what it means to belong to the author who wrote tomorrow before Persia ever dreamed of power. If this spoke to something deep in you, don't keep it buried. Pass it on to someone who's ready to look past the noise, before the next headline tries to drown out an ancient truth that never fades. You've just seen how headlines, ancient text, and unfolding reality collide in ways the evening news will never explain. If this opened your eyes, don't keep it to yourself. Share this with someone who thinks prophecy is just myth, and show them it's a map for courage, not fear. And if you're ready to live awake while the world sleeps, drop a comment below. I choose to stand. Stay alert. Stay anchored. We're not here to panic at the storm. We're here to remember who calms it.